December 27th, 1944, Camiling, Luzon, 21:30 hours. Heat clung to the paddies, and a wet smell of rice straw drifted through the nipa lanes as sentries of the Japanese 10th Division tightened their night cordon. Crickets and distant river water masked the hum at first, a far, even vibration that did not swell like a heavy bomber stream. When silhouettes finally slid out of the dark, low, twin-engined with faint running lights blinked out, lookouts braced for the usual, fragmentation, maybe strafing. Instead, stubby canisters fell from the Marine PBJ-1D bombers, radar-equipped cousins of the Army's B-25D, capable of roughly 275 miles per hour and carrying a few thousand pounds of ordnance, and burst with a wet slap. A syrupy spray fanned across thatch and bamboo, soaking fences and eaves with a clinging shine that smelled strongly of gasoline and something oily, unfamiliar. Seconds later, the village inhaled and ignited. Fire did not pop in tidy circles as with high explosive. It crawled, pooled, and then ran, orange and thick, across rooftops and ditches. Bucket lines failed as the gel answered water with more fury, spitting and adhering to hands and sleeves. Ammunition crackled in cooking huts. Grenades thumped from under fallen rafters. Men rolled in mud that only smeared the burning. Sentries who had trained for flares and tracers stared at a flame that would not lift when fanned, a heat that pressed into the lungs and left a bitter chemical taste. By midnight, survivors had withdrawn into tree lines, coughing through tarry smoke while the bombers curved away on instruments, their right engines fading toward the west. Dawn showed blackened beams and rice stores fused into glossy lumps. Patrols marked perimeters by the shape of scorch rather than shell crater, and company clerks wrote that the Americans had used a jelly fire able to leap trenches and cling to earthworks. Field reports moved up the chain that afternoon, noting the first appearance of such incendiary gel in this sector, and warning that night defenses around villages were no longer tenable without wide fire breaks. Staff officers, searching for an explanation, did not yet know that this living blaze traced back to a 1942 American formula that turned gasoline into a weapon with memory, a story that began far from Luzon and would soon be introduced in formal quantities across the Pacific. Fire had long been parceled into strategy, sieges burned timber, roofs and scorched crops for centuries, but World War II forced planners to rethink incendiaries for jungle and island warfare rather than European stone and steel. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, American analysts in the Chemical Warfare Service began to catalog what conventional bombing failed to touch: thin-walled nipa huts, palm-thatched storage houses, and webbed clusters of supply caches that Japanese units used as improvised depots across the Philippines, Burma, and New Guinea. High explosives shattered beams but often left hollow shelters standing. Humidity and dense foliage swallowed blast effects. By early 1942, that pattern had hardened into a tactical problem: how to deny dispersed. Lightweight cover without needing pinpoint hits on every structure. Around the same time, a small research effort at Harvard, led by chemists including Louis Fieser, moved from academic curiosity into military urgency. Their work experimented with thickening agents that turned volatile gasoline into a viscous gel that would adhere to walls, thatch, and clothing, burning hotter and longer than unthickened fuel and resisting simple dousing. These laboratory trials prioritized adhesion, ignition reliability, and transportability. Formulas had to survive being loaded into canisters and released from low-flying aircraft. The Chemical Warfare Service coordinated tests that simulated tropical humidity and wooden construction so the mixtures could be evaluated against the very shelters American planners intended to. Denied operational feedback from the early island campaigns reinforced the laboratory logic. Reports from Guadalcanal in late 1942 described Japanese troops repeatedly reoccupying splinter-built huts and field warehouses after bombardments. Commanders concluded that rapid area denial, not destruction of every wall, would better isolate garrisons. As Allied airstrips in the Solomons and beyond matured through 1942-1943, fighters and medium bombers could operate lower and with more precision. making tactical delivery of thickened incendiaries feasible. Strategists began to envision coordinated night and dawn strikes that would set whole village belts ablaze, severing supply and morale in a single operation. That confluence, field necessity, chemical invention, and improving air logistics, paved the way for the material soon christened napalm, and set planners toward turning a laboratory gel into a doctrine of battlefield fire. Next, we will examine the chemistry and early field trials that took the formula from lab. Bench to ordnance canister, July 1942. In Harvard's chemistry rooms, the smell of solvent and hot metal, and the scratch of notes. While at Dugway Proving Ground, technicians recorded burn patterns on sand tables, the same problem approached from two directions. Louis Feazer's team discovered that aluminium soaps, metal salts made from long-chain fatty acids, thickened gasoline into a tacky gel that adhered to bamboo, thatch, canvas, and skin. Bench burns showed the difference. Unthickened fuel atomized and often extinguished. The gel flowed slowly, burned longer, and stuck to surfaces, yielding sustained flame temperatures well above ordinary petrol fires. Turning that chemistry into a weapon required ordnance innovation. Engineers designed impact burst canisters that could be mounted beneath fighter and medium bomber wings and rupture on contact, dispersing a contiguous blanket rather than a fine mist. The M47 pattern, followed by M74 variants, standardized volumes and weights, canisters sized at roughly 70 to 80 liters and weighing about 40 to 50 kilograms when filled. Dugway trials measured effectiveness. Single canisters produced dense burning patches. Paired time-staggered drops produced overlapping fire blankets that consumed mock huts in under 90 seconds. Aircraft selection and delivery doctrine followed. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, B-25 Mitchells, and PBJ-1D patrol bombers could carry multiple canisters. Pilots trained to release from 150-300 meters altitude to preserve gel cohesion. Field manuals cautioned that water and sand often failed to extinguish the gel. Suppression tended to smear burning fuel and increase exposure. Logisticians then had to scale production of the aluminium thickeners, equip ordnance shops for safe filling, and prioritize canister manufacture. The decisive technical advantage was blunt. Napalm refused easy extinction and burned with persistent intensity in enclosed structures, a property that turned sheltered villages into untenable liabilities. Next, we examine the first formal field trials and operational employment that brought this technical innovation to the battlefield. March 14, 1943. Salamaua Ridge, Papua New Guinea. Late morning turned the humid air viscous as A-20 Havoc, light bombers from the Allied force, peeled low over the spine of the hill. Their noses pointed for the tree line where Australian infantry had been probing Japanese strongpoints. The ridge housed a tight knot of huts and reinforced lean-tos the defenders used as ammunition dumps and mortar pens. Conventional artillery and strafing had failed to clear them without costly infantry assaults. Two Havocs broke formation and released M47 pattern canisters directly into the defensive belt. The canisters struck, ruptured, and a glossy, oily sheet spread down the slope before bursting into sustained flame that hugged eaves and ran along beaten tracks. Australian observers watching from a scrubbed bench reported an almost immediate collapse of directed fire. Machine gun bursts thinned to silence as flame licked under roofs and pooled around parapets. Where once a trench offered cover, the napalm traversed it like a liquid wall. Ammunition stowed in timber sheds cooked off in small detonations that turned clustered bunkers into bonfires, and men who had been steady under shelling fled downhill in panic, abandoning mortars, rucksacks, and rice sacks in their haste. Field notes and later intelligence dispatches described a new kind of shock. Defenders were not being simply dislodged. They were being overwhelmed by a persistent combustion that refused to be beaten back by bucket lines or quick smothering. Captured. Japanese diaries and post-action interrogations, recovered after the Salamaua operations, expressed the same disbelief. Accounts spoke of flames that clung and spread despite water. leaving survivors paralyzed by fire persistence and unable to mount effective counterattacks. The tactical result was stark. Within hours, the slope's resistance collapsed, and the position was secured with relatively light Allied casualties. A result that quickly prompted requests from frontline commanders for additional napalm loads on subsequent sorties. That first practical use in New Guinea crystallized a lesson for forward commanders. Napalm did not merely destroy material, it broke cohesion and eroded the will to resist. Reports from Salamaua fed straight into planning cycles, and soon ordnance and air staff would work to scale deliveries and refine attack timing, steps that moved the weapon from a tactical novelty toward deliberate, repeatable employment across the Central Pacific. Late July 1943, reports from Salamaua arrived in Rabaul bundled with scorched sketches of collapsed huts, their beams drawn as melted ribs. Intelligence officers there read in clipped breaths, noting how ordinary high explosives had rarely flattened jungle villages, but these new adhesive incendiaries rendered roofs unusable for night ambushes. By early August, dispatches from Leyte described wounded men succumbing faster than expected, their burns penetrating through palm matting and cloth wrappings. Nearby platoons, seeing injuries that could not be smothered out, wavered. Internal memos circulated cautiously to Tokyo, proposing that the Americans had engineered a fuel thickened with some unknown additive, sticky gasoline, one hurried note called. Yet chemical analysts could not identify a precise compound from char samples. Field experiments with water-soaked blankets or sand ended poorly, as both only smeared the fire and extended its reach along bamboo ribbing. Worry spread that food reserves, tightly packed in civilian huts, might ignite in sequences, starving pockets of defenders well before battle. Stories traveled faster than couriers. Infantry rumor mills soon exaggerated, claiming flames chased men into irrigation ditches or leapt across shallow trenches. Patrol routes changed to avoid clustering around ammunition stacks, and in coastal sectors, officers forbade bivouacs near village belts. Radio intercepts reported strained voices from small garrisons, describing sudden walls of fire that forced hasty withdrawals and left machine gun nests empty by dawn. Naval staff, reading summaries of island airfields with wooden hangars, fretted that aircraft might now be lost not to bombs, but to lingering heat clinging to paneling. Skeptics in Tokyo dismissed much of this as fear layered onto fatigue, but others urged rapid expansion of coral and earth revetments, deeper berms, and stone-lined shelters. Through August and into September, the uncertainty itself became corrosive. Commanders began to plan around the expectation that any concentrated structure might become a furnace. Anxiety thickened as Allied production lines accelerated, hinting at a wider arc of upcoming operations across the Central Pacific, where this unsettling weapon could broaden its destructive imprint. In that tense atmosphere, both sides edged toward the next phase, scaled assaults that would test the psychological limits of defenders facing fire that refused to die. As alarm spread through enemy ranks, American industry answered with a steady, grinding tempo. From late 1943 into spring 1944, chemical plants in New Jersey and Ohio ramped up production of aluminium soaps and related thickeners, while blending facilities in Pennsylvania converted bulk gasoline into hardened, transportable loads. Monthly yields climbed past 400,000 liters, shipped in drums to ordnance depots where Midwestern factories welded and finished M47 and M74 canisters on adapted automotive lines. Assembly shops that once bolted fenders now seam-welded ordnance cylinders in batches measured by the thousands. At San Francisco and Pearl Harbor, quartermasters threaded convoy manifests to match frontline requirements. Timing sailing, so newly captured airfields received initial napalm consignments within weeks of their seizure. Supply officers routed material to staging bases such as Munda Point and Espiritu Santo, where ground crews trained ordnance crews to safely fill canisters and service impact fuses. On the home front, training ranges multiplied mock Pacific villages, timbered huts, thatch roofs, narrow tracks, constructed in Arizona and California deserts to teach pilots release runs and fuse timing under conditions of heat and dust. Flight schools issued standardized procedures, approach angles, altitudes between 150 and 300 meters, and staggered release patterns to create overlapping burn blankets. The USAF printed tactical pamphlets for coordination between air and infantry units, specifying target priorities, storage clusters, hut intersections, approaches to airstrips, and prescribing follow-up suppression. Logistics worked to minimize wastage, canister loading sequences, sealed transport cradles, and repair battalions to refurbish spent ordnance casings for reuse. The result was operational certainty. Commanders could order napalm pre-deployment as confidently as ammunition or fuel. That industrial guarantee reshaped campaign tempo, allowing planners to compress preparatory bombardments and move faster into assault phases, a capability that would be tested soon in larger Central Pacific operations. Decisively so. June 18, 1944, Saipan's ridgeline shimmered beneath mid-morning heat as U.S. Marines clawed upward toward Mount Tapochau, while Japanese defenders threaded village alleys near Garapan to stage night counterattacks. Marine corsairs roared in low, and when their napalm canisters opened over suspected assembly points, the gel cascaded between wooden walls and under raised floorboards. It found food caches, stacked rice bags, and the cloth wrappings around mortar rounds, turning whole alleyways into continuous flame paths. Survivors staggering from the inferno described fire that clung to canvas ammunition pouches. Belts of cartridges cooked off in staccato bursts as men tore at burning uniforms. From observation posts on higher ground, Japanese commanders watched their own urban scaffolding dissolve, realizing that each strike eroded not just shelter, but the logistical backbone for night operations. As the Marianas campaign widened to Tinian and Guam through July and August, napalm repeated this grim arithmetic. Small coastal villages that had once anchored machine gun nests were neutralized with one or two overlapping drops. Naval aviators recorded that such sorties replaced dozens of artillery shells and significantly reduced the need for costly infantry house-to-house fighting. American planners noted with growing confidence that area suppression by persistent fire correlated with fewer Marine casualties, and that defenders often abandoned entrenched positions before close combat. The tactical pressure forced hard choices: remain within flammable shelter at risk of conflagration or retreat into open ground, vulnerable to daylight strafing and naval gunfire. Dispatches captured on Tinian referenced an unstoppable fire, and frontline officers began urging coral-bedded bunkers and earthen shelters in lieu of village walls. Yet the shift brought little respite. Open ground exposed movement. Caves and tunnels risked suffocation if flames pooled near entrances. Each adjustment bled the defenders of initiative. By the close of summer, the Marianas blazes demonstrated napalm's consistent ability to hollow resistance quickly, shortening battles that might have dragged on for weeks. With the island secured, naval forces turned their attention westward, toward operations edging closer to the Japanese homeland, where caves, ravines, and deep dugouts would test whether fire could drive defenders from rock as mercilessly as it had from wood. October 1944. On Leyte opened with thick clouds clinging low to the coastal plains and the smell of burned rice straw settling into the villages that marked Japanese forward posts. When P-38 Lightnings swept in over the coconut groves, their bellies armed with napalm canisters, defenders expected fragmentation bursts and strafing. Instead, whole medical huts and ammunition dumps ignited in slow, rolling sheets of flame that curled beneath doorways and wrapped along palm leaf seams. Surviving infantrymen described the sensation as a physical wave of heat rising at their backs, forcing them into disorganized withdrawals that fractured platoon cohesion. Some staggered into tree lines only to find their escape cut off by embers that drifted into dry undergrowth. In the humid haze of late afternoon, napalm's persistence created a lingering glow that seemed to stalk the wounded. Rumors blossomed in jungle cantonments that the Americans dropped fire sacks able to crawl under shelter. By November, Company records in several locales around Leyte Gulf noted increased desertion of night outposts. Enlisted men refused to sleep inside wooden structures, fearing a surprise drop that might trap them beneath collapsing roofs. Allied interrogators cataloged a recurring theme among prisoners: nightmares of adhesive flame and the horror of burns that water could not quickly quench. These accounts offered concrete evidence of psychological degradation. Conversely, U.S. infantry morale improved as engagements featured fewer intact huts shielding ambushers. Burned rice caches starved Japanese troops of calories required for night counterattacks, and scorched ammunition stores forced reliance on single-shot volleys rather than sustained fire. By January 1945, the Japanese circulated hurried field manuals instructing garrisons to disperse supplies and dig deeper trenches. But shipping shortages prevented widespread adoption. Officers tried rotating troops through open bivouacs away from villages, yet this exposed them to daylight strafing and the fatigue of constant movement. The morale gap widened irreversibly. Allied pilots refined attack geometry to pour gel along alley junctions, magnifying confusion and driving defenders into fragmented pockets. Each strike underscored American industrial dominance, leaving Japanese infantry increasingly convinced that resistance against a fire that refused to die was futile. These psychological fractures would trail the defenders back toward Japan's outer defensive rings, where the terrain promised deeper fortifications and new horrors when flame met. Rock, February 1945. On Iwo Jima found the air heavy with sulfur and cordite as Marines pushed across volcanic ash toward the cave mouths that riddled the island's slopes. The Japanese 109th Division had engineered a formidable lattice O. Napalm became a tool of displacement rather than destruction. Thickened fuel poured across entrances, sending waves of heat and smoke downwards. Defenders, choking and blinded, stumbled into the open where machine gun teams waited along predetermined arcs of fire. While the island's porous rock did not burn, wooden pallets, tentage, and ammunition stacks tucked into depressions ignited readily. Ordnance officers directed pilots to strike these vulnerable hubs, depriving garrisons of mortar rounds and grenades essential for counterattacks in the night. By April on Okinawa, ravine-bound villages provided protective canopy for artillery spotters, their wooden beams offering concealment from aerial reconnaissance. Napalm raids erased that cover in minutes, revealing observation posts and forcing rapid retreat across open fields. Armor and infantry advanced more confidently, mapping enemy positions by the trails of defenders fleeing the flames. Pre-assault saturation meant fewer artillery shells spent plastering every suspected bunker. Commanders economized fire missions, conserving ammunition for counter-battery strikes. Japanese planners attempted to bury supply nodes deeper underground, but shortages of cement, steel, and labor hampered thorough construction. Earthworks that lacked timber supports collapsed when heated, and deeper burrows suffered from suffocating fumes when napalm pooled near entrances. Strategically, these patterns shortened sieges. Once villages and storage hubs behind the front were set alight, defenders lost not only shelter but the calories and cartridges required to hold for weeks. Communications frayed as telephone lines melted and runners refused to pass through smoldering alleys. American operational tempo quickened. Multiple landings across adjacent islands could be sustained because each required fewer days of preparatory bombardment. Combined arms pressure bent brittle defenses where logistics could no longer support improvisation. As 1945 advanced, napalm's cumulative effects tightened the noose on Japan's shrinking perimeter, driving defenders to adapt amid devastation, and setting the conditions for even harsher confrontations. On the approaches to the home islands, May 1945 across the Bonin chain revealed the first clear edges of napalm's reach. On islands dominated by volcanic stone, thickened gasoline splashed brilliantly across cave mouths, yet could not always penetrate deeply unless the canister struck at a precise angle. Japanese engineers anticipated this shortfall and expanded tunnel corridors behind bends that swallowed the heat, adding stone blast doors that could be sealed between bombing runs. Reinforced chambers stored rice, mortar rounds, and small arms ammunition behind earthen choke points deliberately angled to trap flame and smoke before they reached vital stockpiles. Around village outskirts, labor battalions heaped earthen berms to blunt the spread of fire toward interior dwellings, turning whole districts into layered fire breaks. In the jungles of the central Philippines, monsoon bursts dampened thatch and slowed ignition. Thick mud suffocated smaller flame patches that detached from the larger gel blankets. For Allied aviators, durability cut both ways. Delivering canisters at low altitude meant plunging through arcs of anti-aircraft fire that had grown thicker by mid-1945. Pilots described flak bursts that forced last-second adjustments, scattering patterns and leaving unintended gaps in burning belts. To counter these vulnerabilities, U.S. air staffs refined fuse timing and angle of approach tactics, adopting oblique releases that rolled gel downhill into ravines and depressions otherwise shielded from direct hits. Field manuals updated altitude windows and recommended staggered drops to ensure overlapping coverage. Infantry platoons supplemented airstrikes with backpack flamethrowers, walking fire along cave lips where napalm had thinned. And engineers cleared vegetation to prevent wet foliage from forming accidental fire breaks. Japan's countermeasures strained its war economy. Coral bunkers and deep revetments resisted flame but demanded immense labor. Shortages of cement and steel forced compromises, leaving many shelters half-finished. Where construction was rushed, entrances lacked proper ventilation, creating lethal pockets when napalm pooled nearby and oxygen vanished. Monsoon humidity and stone offered respite only briefly. Each adaptation bought hours or days, not weeks. As the Pacific War pressed into its final year, commanders on both sides recognized a larger truth. Napalm's power lay not solely in destruction, but in how it sculpted terrain, collapsing comfortable shelter into exposed ground and transforming defensive geometry. This dance of weapon and countermeasure clarified the weapon's legacy and pointed toward the final campaigns where fire and fortification would collide on the doorsteps of the home islands. By late summer 1945, as the Pacific thunder quieted and dispatches thinned, Allied analysts gathered field notes that traced a through line from Salamaua to Okinawa. Thickened gasoline, they concluded, excelled at disrupting infantry concentration, igniting storage nodes, and stripping camouflage from village belts that once hid spotters and ammunition. Reports from Okinawa correlated persistent flame with sudden spikes in surrender, suggesting that napalm's tenacity eroded the psychological scaffolding that held isolated units together. Captured Japanese officers later admitted that the weapon destroyed the illusion of sanctuary within wooden walls. A hut became a trap, not a refuge. For American planners, the doctrine was straightforward. Area denial by fire conserved artillery shells and compressed assault timelines, freeing guns for counter-battery missions instead of grueling house-to-house reduction. Procurement offices urged continued investment in gelled fuels, anticipating conflicts where combustible shelter would again define the battle space. Even as the war edged toward conclusion, production lines remained active through August, hedging against the possibility of a mainland invasion. Warehouses stacked canisters beside pontoons and medical kits, and ordnance manuals refined guidance on terrain transformation. Burning alley junctions, collapsing supply lattices, and sowing panic along retreat routes. By September, theorists distilled these lessons into early post-war evaluations, arguing that any army dependent on flammable cover risked rapid collapse if confronted by persistent incendiary saturation. They predicted flame's utility in denying safe havens, degrading morale, and forcing opponents into exposed fallback positions. Diplomats, contemplating reconstruction, could not ignore the charred silhouettes of villages burned overnight. Those images shaped perceptions of industrial firepower as a tool not only of destruction, but of psychological compulsion, an influence that seeped into the conceptual lexicon of area denial. As demobilization loomed and veterans packed their kits, memories of orange tongues racing along bamboo ribs persisted. The narrative curved back to those first witnesses on jungle ridges, whose stunned reports foretold a weapon that would linger in doctrine long after the last embers cooled. Years later on Luzon, where blackened nipa posts still protruded like ribs from the earth, survivors recalled the December 1944 night when unfamiliar canisters splashed liquid flame down narrow lanes. Former Japanese infantry spoke of the instant their sense of control vanished, when gel clung to walls and fed an unending blaze that turned huts into chimneys of heat. American veterans, meanwhile, remembered how napalm seemed to embody industrial precision, cutting supply lines, collapsing morale, and shortening battles that might have demanded weeks of grinding attrition. Letters home described surreal vistas of burning roofs illuminating jungle canopy, the orange glow washing over palm fronds like sunrise in the dead of night. In Tokyo, planners wrestled with countermeasures they could not field fast enough. Resource scarcity and failing logistics left villages vulnerable. Historians later argued that napalm accelerated the war's final phases by stripping defenders of their spiritual anchor, the sheltering village that made night operations possible. When the flames guttered out, charred beams remained as monuments to escalating warfare. Napalm marked a turning point when fire ceased being a chaotic byproduct and became a sculpted instrument of terrain transformation. Its persistence haunted post-war reconstruction as communities rebuilt atop memories of nights when flame flowed like water. In reflection, one sees how innovation can alter the geometry of conflict, weaving industrial chemistry into tactical doctrine. And as the embers cooled beneath moonlit canopy, the story returned to those stunned infantrymen who first confronted adhesive flame, forever changed in their understanding of war's evolving reach.